Dr. Lena Vasic stood at the observation window of the deep survey vessel Archimedes and stared out at a sky full of stars that had never known a single living thing besides the humans who came to look at them. She had spent 11 years searching for life beyond Earth, and she had found none. Not a microbe, not a fossil, not a single strand of alien protein hiding in the soil of some distant moon, not even the chemical echo of something that had tried to live and failed. Nothing. The Archimedes had just completed its final scan of the Kepler 442 system, a place that scientists back on Earth had once called the most promising candidate for extraterrestrial life in the known galaxy. And the results were the same as every other survey humanity had ever conducted. Sterile rock, sterile ice, sterile gas, and silence so deep it made her chest hurt. Lena pressed her hand against the cold glass and let out a long breath that fogged the surface for just a moment before it faded. Behind her, the bridge crew worked quietly at their stations, and nobody spoke, because nobody needed to say what they were all thinking. They had come looking for neighbors, and found an empty house that stretched forever in every direction. She turned away from the window and walked to the communications console where her chief technician, a young man named Davy, sat waiting with the transmission report already prepared. "Send it," Lena said. Davy hesitated for just a second, and then he pressed the key, and the report flew outward at the speed of light, toward the relay stations that would carry it back to the United Terran Consensus, the governing body of all human space. The report was simple in its conclusion. After 300 years of expansion across 200 star systems, and after thousands of biological surveys conducted on every kind of world imaginable, humanity could now say with statistical certainty that life had occurred in the universe exactly one time, on one planet, in one unremarkable solar system on the outer arm of one ordinary galaxy. Earth was it. Humanity was it. There was nothing else, and there never had been. When the report reached the inner systems 3 weeks later, the reaction was like a wave that rolled across civilization and left everything different in its wake. The media called it the final silence, and the name stuck because it was the right name for what it was. Some people wept when they heard the news because they had always believed that somewhere out there in the vast dark, something else was alive and thinking, and wondering the same things humans wondered. Some people prayed, though the prayers sounded different now because the idea that a creator had built a universe this enormous and filled it with only one tiny species of thinking creature raised questions that no holy book had ever tried to answer. Some people celebrated, and Lena did not understand those people at first, but she came to understand them later. They celebrated because if humanity was the only life, then humanity was not just rare. It was singular and precious beyond any calculation. There was no competition out there in the dark, no predator waiting in the black between the stars, no ancient civilization that might one day look at humanity the way humans looked at insects. Humanity was alone, and that meant humanity was safe in a way that no species had ever dared to imagine. The United Terran Consensus called an emergency gathering of leaders and thinkers and scientists and philosophers from every corner of human space, and they named it the Concord of Purpose because the question they needed to answer was the biggest question anyone had ever asked. If we are alone, what do we owe the universe? Lena was invited to attend, but she did not go because she was tired in a way that sleep could not fix, and because she had already begun to suspect that the question itself was wrong. She stayed aboard the Archimedes, and she read the transcripts of the debates as they came in over the relay, and she watched the arguments unfold with the strange detachment of someone who had stared into the emptiness longer than anyone else, and had started to see shapes in it. Meanwhile, at the very edge of map space, something was happening that nobody important was paying attention to. A decommissioned relay station orbiting a dead star in the Vega corridor had been running on automatic for 6 years, and its sensors had been quietly collecting data that nobody had bothered to download because the station was scheduled for salvage and nobody cared about data from a stretch of space that contained nothing of interest. But a junior analyst named Roe Godden cared. Roe was 23 years old and he worked in the data processing center on Titan, and his job was to sort through old sensor logs and flag anything unusual before the records were archived and forgotten. Most of the time there was nothing to flag, and Roe spent his shifts drinking bad coffee and reading adventure novels on his tablet. But on this particular night, he found something that made him set his coffee down and lean forward in his chair. The relay station sensors had recorded a region of space approximately 4 light-years from the station, where the cosmic background radiation simply stopped. Not weakened, not shifted, not distorted by some gravitational effect that could be explained by known physics. It just stopped. There was a boundary, sharp and clean, beyond which the sensors detected absolutely nothing at all. No radiation of any kind, no particles, no energy, no signal, nothing. It was not darkness in the way that empty space was dark, because even empty space was full of things if you had sensitive enough instruments to detect them. This was something else entirely. This was a place where the universe itself seemed to end, not at the edge of everything, but right there in the middle of the galaxy like a hole cut into a painting. Roe stared at the data for a long time, and then he wrote up a report and flagged it as a priority anomaly, and submitted it through the proper channels, and waited for someone to respond. Nobody did. His report landed on the desk of a mid-level administrator who glanced at it and decided it was probably a sensor malfunction and filed it in a queue that was already 3 months behind, and that was that. Roe went back to his coffee and his novels, but he did not forget what he had seen, and late at night when his shift was over and the processing center was quiet, he would pull up the data again and stare at that sharp, clean edge where everything became nothing, and he would feel something cold move through his chest like a whisper. Out on the Archimedes, Lena sat alone in her quarters and looked at the ceiling and thought about a universe that was beautiful beyond description and completely, perfectly, terribly empty. She thought about forests on Earth where every tree was full of birds and every stone had insects beneath it, and every drop of water held 1,000 tiny living things. And she thought about how all of that was a miracle so unlikely that it had happened only once in the entire history of everything. She thought about what it meant to be the only eyes that would ever see the light of distant stars, and the only minds that would ever wonder what those stars were made of, and the only hearts that would ever feel small beneath a sky too big to comprehend. And she thought about the silence. Not the silence of a room with no one talking, but the silence of a universe with no one in it. A silence so vast and so old that it had been the only sound there was for billions of years before a small blue planet had dared to break it. Somewhere in that silence, she felt sure, there was an answer to a question she had not yet learned how to ask. She closed her eyes and the stars burned on without her, and the empty worlds turned slowly in the dark, and the universe held its breath the way it always had, waiting for someone to notice that something was not right. And far away, in a place where nothing existed at all, the nothing grew just a little bit larger. 2 years after the final silence changed everything, humanity was still arguing about what to do with the knowledge that it was alone. But something had shifted in those 2 years, something deep and quiet and powerful, like a river changing direction underground where nobody could see it. People had stopped mourning. The concord of purpose had produced endless debates and speeches and papers and proposals, but in the end it came down to one idea that rose above all the others and refused to be ignored. They called it the obligation of existence, and it was simple enough that a child could understand it. If humanity was the only conscious life in the universe, Then every star that burned without anyone to see it was a tragedy. Every sunset on every empty world was a beautiful thing wasted. Every mountain and ocean and canyon that existed without a witness was a story that would never be told. Consciousness had a duty to spread, not for profit or power or survival, but simply because someone had to be there to look at the sky and know that it was beautiful. The idea caught fire across human space, and within months the seeding initiative was born. Thousands of automated ships launched from orbital shipyards above a dozen worlds, loaded not with weapons or mining equipment, but with terraforming machines designed to prepare planets for the day when human beings could stand on their soil and breathe their air and watch their sunsets. It was the largest project humanity had ever attempted, and it had nothing to do with resources or territory. It was about making sure that as much of the universe as possible had someone to see it. Captain Idris Mwangi stood on the bridge of the Torch of Iran and watched the seed ships launch, and he did not know what to feel. He was 41 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life training for war, learning tactics and strategy and weapons systems, preparing for the day when humanity might encounter something hostile in the dark between the stars. That day was never going to come. The Torch of Iran was a warship, one of the finest in the UTC fleet, and now it had been reassigned to escort duty, following seed ships to the frontier and making sure nothing went wrong during their deployment. Nothing ever went wrong because there was nothing out there to cause trouble. Mwangi stood with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the last seed ship clear the launch bay, and he thought about what it meant to be a soldier in a universe with no enemy. His first officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Talia Reyes, stepped up beside him and said nothing for a while, and then she said, "You look like a man who lost his purpose." Mwangi smiled, but it did not reach his eyes, and he said, "I trained to protect humanity from threats, and there are no threats." "Maybe that is the threat," Talia said, and Mwangi looked at her, and she shrugged and said, "A species with no enemy has no reason to stay sharp, and a species that is not sharp does not survive." He thought about that for a long time after she walked away. On Earth and across the colonies, a new movement was growing alongside the seeding initiative, a group that called themselves the Witnesses. The Witnesses believed that humanity's most sacred role was not to build or conquer or even to survive, but simply to observe, to be the universe's eyes and ears and memory. They said that a star that burned for 1 billion years meant nothing if no one ever knew it was there, that the universe without a witness was like a song sung in an empty room, technically real but meaningless in every way that mattered. The Witnesses began construction of the Eternal Archive, a structure built deep inside the most stable asteroid they could find, designed to outlast stars, encoding everything humanity had ever known or seen or felt or dreamed into a medium that could endure for trillions of years. It was humanity's memory made permanent, a record that would prove that someone had been here, that someone had looked up and understood. And it was beautiful. But while humanity was busy learning how to be the universe's only witness, Lena Vasic was on her way to find out why. The anomaly that Ro Gaudin had flagged 2 years ago had finally been noticed by someone with the authority to do something about it, and that someone had come looking for Lena because she was the most famous scientist in human space, and because she was already at the frontier. She took the Archimedes and a crew of 32, and she flew to the edge of known space, and what she found there was the most terrifying thing any human being had ever seen. It was a sphere. Not a solid sphere, not a visible sphere, not something you could look at and understand in any normal way. It was a sphere of absence, 4.7 astronomical units in diameter, hanging in space like a wound that would not heal. The instruments confirmed what Ro's old relay station had detected 2 years ago. Inside the sphere there was nothing. Not empty space, because empty space still contained quantum fluctuations and virtual particles, and the faint hum of cosmic background radiation that was the echo of the universe's birth. This was not that. Inside the sphere there was no matter, no energy, no radiation, no quantum field activity of any kind. It was not empty in the way that a box with nothing in it was empty. It was empty in the way that a place that had never existed was empty. The chief physicist on Lena's team, a quiet man named Tomas, ran every test he could think of, and then he turned to her with a face the color of old paper and said, "This is not a void, this is not a gap, this is not a region where things used to be." "Then what is it?" Lena asked. Tomas swallowed and said, "It is a region where things are not allowed to be, where existence itself has been revoked like a permission that was taken away." Lena stared at the readings on her screen and felt the cold thing that Ro must have felt 2 years ago, that whisper in the chest, that slow, awful understanding that something was deeply and fundamentally wrong. She named it the null. The name spread quickly once her preliminary report reached the inner systems, and people talked about it the way people talk about earthquakes and plagues, with that mixture of fascination and dread that comes from knowing that something terrible is real, and that knowing about it does not make it less terrible. Mwangi heard about the null while the Torch of Iran was escorting a convoy of siege ships to a new system near the Galactic Rim, and he read Lena's report 3 times, and each time he read it, he felt something tighten inside him, something that had been loose and purposeless for 2 years, something that felt very much like the instinct he had been trained to trust. The instinct that said danger was real and it was close. He sent a private message to Lena on a secure channel, and he asked her one question. "Is it growing?" Lena read his message in her quarters aboard the Archimedes, surrounded by data pads and empty coffee cups and the silence of a ship at the edge of everything. And she thought about lying because the truth was worse than anything she had imagined. But she did not lie. She wrote back 2 words. "It is." And across human space, in the new temples of the witnesses and the busy shipyards of the Seeding Initiative, and the quiet offices where analysts like Ro Godden sorted through data that nobody else cared about, life went on as it always had, beautiful and fragile and completely unaware that the darkness at the edge of the map was not darkness at all. It was the end of everything, and it was getting closer. The stars burned and the seed ships flew, and humanity dreamed of a future where every corner of the universe would have someone to see it, and none of them knew yet that the universe had a very different plan. The null sat in the silence of deep space, and it did not think because thinking requires existence, and it did not want because wanting requires a mind. But it grew, slowly, steadily, with the patience of something that had been waiting since before time had a name. It grew. And the light around its edges dimmed just a little more with every passing day. The null was not alone. That was the first terrible thing they learned in the years that followed Lena's discovery. Deep space survey teams armed with new sensor arrays designed specifically to detect regions of non-existence swept the galaxy in every direction, and what they found turned the cold whisper in Lena's chest into a scream. There were dozens of them, scattered across the Milky Way like holes in a net, each one a perfect sphere of absolute nothing, each one growing, each one expanding outward with the slow patience of a tide that would never stop rising. Some were small, barely a few thousand kilometers across, tucked away in the dark spaces between stars where no one had ever thought to look. Others were enormous, swallowing entire regions of empty space that had once held dust clouds and asteroid fields, and the raw materials from which new stars might one day have been born. The second terrible thing they learned came from a man named Dr. Osei Akbe. Osei was 60 years old, and he had spent most of his career being called brilliant by people who liked him, and being called insane by people who did not, and he had never particularly cared which label people used because he was too busy thinking about the fundamental nature of reality to worry about what other humans thought of him. He had been studying the null data for 3 years when he published a paper that changed everything for the second time in a decade. The paper was long and dense and full of mathematics that only a few hundred people in all of human space could follow, but its conclusion was simple enough to fit in a single sentence. The universe does not want to exist. HFY argued that the natural state of reality was not existence but non-existence, that matter and energy and the laws of physics themselves were not the default condition of the cosmos, but rather a temporary deviation from it, a fluctuation, an error in an equation that was slowly and inevitably resolving itself back to zero. The nulls were not anomalies, he said. They were corrections. They were the universe fixing itself, erasing the mistake of existence the way a body fights off an infection, slowly and methodically, and without anything that could be called mercy. And here was the part that made people stop breathing when they read it. Life had not failed to arise on other worlds because of bad luck or wrong chemistry, or any of the 1,000 explanations that scientists had offered over the centuries. Life had failed to arise because the universe actively destroyed it before it could take hold. On every world in every system across the entire galaxy, the conditions for life had existed at some point: the right chemicals, the right temperatures, the right balance of water and energy, and on every single one of those worlds the universe had reached in and snuffed out the spark before it could catch. Every world except one. Earth. Somehow, for reasons that HFY could not explain, and that kept him awake at night staring at his ceiling, life on Earth had slipped through the cracks, had survived the correction, had grown and spread and become complex enough to produce consciousness before the universe could stop it. Humanity was not alone because the cosmos was too big or too old or too indifferent. Humanity was alone because nothing else had ever been allowed to exist. The reaction to HFY's paper was not like the final silence, which had rolled across civilization like a slow wave of grief and wonder. This was a shock, a blow, a fist to the stomach that left people gasping. Because there was a difference between being alone in a universe that did not care and being alone in a universe that was actively trying to erase you. The witnesses declared that this made their mission more important than ever, that if the universe was trying to unmake existence, then the act of witnessing and remembering was not just sacred but necessary, an act of defiance against the fundamental nature of reality itself. Others were not so brave. A wave of despair swept through the outer colonies, and there were people who looked at the data and the math and the growing nulls and concluded that fighting was pointless, that the universe was bigger than humanity and older than humanity, and that in the end the nothing would win because the nothing had always been winning. Captain Idris Mwangi, now promoted to the rank of admiral, did not have time for despair. The UTC had ordered him to take a fleet of 12 warships and establish a defensive perimeter around the nearest null, a mid-sized sphere that was expanding toward a cluster of 3 inhabited systems. And so he went because going was what he did. He stood on the bridge of the Torch of Orion and looked at the null on the display screen, and it looked like a black circle against the stars, except that it was not black because black was a color, and this was the absence of color, the absence of everything, and looking at it made something deep inside his brain want to look away. "Hold position at 500,000 kilometers, he ordered, and his voice was steady because he had trained it to be steady, and he was grateful for that training now more than ever. A patrol ship, the Dawnrunner, was assigned to map the null's boundary at close range, and its crew were volunteers who knew the risks or thought they did. The Dawnrunner moved in slowly, sensors sweeping the edge of the null, transmitting data back to the fleet in real time. At 300,000 kilometers, they reported that their instruments were behaving strangely, readings flickering, calibrations drifting. At 200,000 kilometers, the pilot reported that she could see the boundary now, not with the ship's sensors but with her own eyes through the cockpit window, a place where the stars simply ended, a line drawn across the sky beyond which there was nothing at all. At 150,000 kilometers, the Dawnrunner crossed a threshold that no one had known existed. The ship did not explode. It did not break apart or burn or send a distress signal. One moment it was there on every sensor screen in the fleet, a small bright dot moving against the dark, crewed by 14 people who had families and histories and names. The next moment it was gone. Not destroyed, not damaged, not lost. Gone. The sensors showed nothing because there was nothing to show. The space where the Dawnrunner had been was empty in the same way the null itself was empty, as though the ship and its crew had never existed, as though the universe had simply decided that they were not real and had erased them the way a person erases a word from a page. Mwangi stood on his bridge and stared at the empty space on his display, and he felt the weight of 14 lives that he could not mourn because there was nothing left to mourn, no wreckage to recover, no bodies to bury, no last words to remember. They had been unwritten. And in her lab aboard the Archimedes, Lena Vasic worked alongside Osa Ape, the two of them surrounded by screens and equations and the growing certainty that they were running out of time. They had been studying the quantum noise at the edges of the nulls, the faint distortions in spacetime where existence met non-existence, and they had found something that neither of them wanted to believe. A pattern. The nulls did not grow randomly. They did not expand in all directions equally. They did not behave like natural phenomena at all. They moved with structure, with something that looked horribly like purpose, adjusting their growth in response to the distribution of matter around them, reaching toward dense regions and pulling back from empty ones as though they were following a strategy. "This is not entropy," Os said quietly one night as they sat together in the dim light of the lab with coffee growing cold on the table between them. "No," Lena agreed, and her voice was barely a whisper. "This is not the universe winding down or falling apart or decaying into heat death. No. This is something else," Osa said, and he looked at her with eyes that held a fear she had never seen in him before, a fear that went deeper than death because death was natural and this was not. "Something is doing this on purpose," Lena said. Osai nodded slowly, and the lab was very quiet, and somewhere far away, a null grew a little larger, and another star that no one had named vanished from the sky forever. The universe was not simply returning to nothing. Something in the nothing was pulling it there. And it had been doing so since before humanity existed, since before Earth existed, since before the first atom had formed in the fires of creation. It was old, and it was patient, and it was winning. And now, for the first time in all those billions of years, it had something to fight against. Something small and stubborn and scared. Something alive. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday, and it came not from a laboratory or a supercomputer but from a mistake. A research station orbiting a gas giant called Meridian 7 had been conducting long-range scans of a nearby null when its primary sensor array malfunctioned and began broadcasting a focused beam of quantum-entangled particles directly into the null's boundary. The station's chief engineer scrambled to shut down the array, but before she could, something impossible happened. The null retreated. Not by much, barely a few kilometers, but the instruments recorded it clearly and unmistakably. For the first time since the nulls had been discovered, one of them had moved backward. The data reached Lena Vasic and Osai Ache within hours, and they spent 3 sleepless days analyzing it before they understood what had happened. The sensor malfunction had not just broadcast particles into the null, it had broadcast particles that were entangled with the station's monitoring systems, particles that were being observed, measured, and recorded by conscious minds in real time. And the null had flinched. Osai sat back in his chair and pressed his hands over his face, and stayed that way for a long time, and when he finally lowered his hands his eyes were red, and his voice was rough. "It is us," he said. Lena waited. "Consciousness," Osai said, and the word hung in the air like something sacred and terrible all at once. Human consciousness, the act of observing, of being aware, of knowing that you exist and that the things around you exist. It has a physical effect on local spacetime. It stabilizes reality. It makes existence more real. Lena understood immediately, and the understanding hit her like a wave of cold water. That was why the nulls avoided populated systems. That was why they grew fastest in the empty spaces between stars, where no one lived and no one watched. That was why life on Earth had survived, when life on every other world had been erased. Once consciousness emerged, once something looked at the universe and knew it was real, that knowledge acted like an anchor, pinning reality in place, making it harder for the nothing to unmake it. Humanity was not just the only life in the universe. Humanity was the only thing keeping the universe real. The implications were so enormous that Lena felt dizzy when she thought about them, and she had to sit down on the floor of the lab with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up to her chest, and she stayed there for a while just breathing. When the findings were published, the effect on human civilization was like setting fire to dry grass. Every argument, every doubt, every philosophical question about humanity's purpose and meaning was answered in a single stroke. The obligation of existence was not just a philosophy anymore. It was physics. It was survival. It was the literal mechanism by which reality continued to be real. The United Terran Consensus declared what they called the Vigil, and it was the largest mobilization in the history of the human species. Every colony, every ship, every outpost, every station was given a new mission on top of whatever it had been doing before. Spread consciousness as far and as fast as possible. Populate every reachable corner of space. Build artificial intelligences, complex enough to observe and be aware. Wake the universe up system by system, and hold it in place by the sheer force of knowing it was there. Admiral Idris Mwangi was given command of the Vanguard Fleet, a collection of every warship and transport and colony vessel that could be spared from the inner systems, and his mission was to race ahead of the largest and fastest-growing null, a monster that the analysts had designated Null Prime, and establish crude outposts in its path. Null Prime was sweeping toward the galactic core, and if it reached the dense star clusters there, it would grow faster than anything humanity could stop. Mwangi stood on the bridge of the Torch of Orion and looked at the star charts showing Null Prime's projected path, and he thought about the Dawnrunner and its 14 crew members who had been unwritten from existence, and he felt something settle inside him, something hard and cold and certain. He had spent years wondering what a soldier was supposed to do in a universe with no enemy. Now he knew. Humanity built the anchor stations. They were enormous installations, each one crewed by thousands of volunteers, designed to amplify the stabilizing effect of conscious observation across light years of space. The technology was new and imperfect, and based on principles that even Osai admitted he did not fully understand, but it worked. Each anchor station projected a field of stabilized reality around itself like a bubble of light in the dark, pushing back the nothing, holding existence together by the combined force of every mind aboard. The volunteers who crewed the anchor stations knew what they were, and they went anyway. They were not soldiers in any traditional sense. They carried no weapons and fought no battles, but they were the front line of a war more desperate than any war humanity had ever fought. They were witnesses in the truest sense of the word, people who held existence together by the act of being aware of it. And they died. Not quickly, not in a blaze of glory, but slowly and terribly as the nulls pressed against their fields, and the fields weakened, and the stations struggled to maintain their anchor against the endless patient pressure of non-existence. Station Prometheus was the first to fall. It was positioned in the path of Null Prime, a last line of defense before a cluster of 3 inhabited systems, and its crew of 12,000 people held their posts as the Null bore down on them. They could see it coming on their instruments, a wall of nothing advancing at a speed that should have been impossible, accelerating as though it had sensed their resistance and decided to push harder. The station commander, a woman named Io Akafer, sent a final transmission to Admiral Mwangi as the Null's edge reached the outer boundary of the station's field. "We are still here," she said, and her voice was calm and clear. "We are still watching and we will not look away." The 12,000 held their posts. They did not run because there was nowhere to run, and because running would have meant abandoning the 3 colony ships that were still evacuating civilians from the systems behind them. They stood at their stations and they observed and they recorded, and they insisted that they were real, that the universe around them was real, that the stars and the atoms and the light were real. And the null reached them and they were gone. Not dead. Gone. 12,000 lives erased so completely that the universe did not even remember they had been there. But the 3 colony ships made it out, and the 60,000 people on those ships survived, because 12,000 others had chosen to stand between them and the nothing, and had held it back long enough with nothing but the force of their awareness. Mwangi received the last transmission from Station Prometheus, and he listened to Io's voice, calm and clear and unafraid, and he closed his eyes and pressed his fist against his chest and said nothing for a long time. Then he opened his eyes and gave orders, and the Vanguard fleet moved on, because there was no time to stop. Back on the Archimedes, Lena made one more discovery, and it was the worst one yet. Null Prime was accelerating. Not gradually, not predictably, but in direct response to humanity's resistance. Every anchor station they built, every outpost they established, every act of defiance they committed against the nothing was met with an equal and greater push from the other side. And at the center of Null Prime, buried deep in the quantum noise that marked the boundary between something and nothing, Lena found coherent information. Not thoughts, not words, not anything that could be called a language, but structure, pattern, response, adaptation. Something that looked and behaved and felt like intent. The null was not a natural force. It was not entropy or decay or the universe winding down. Something was in there, something that existed in the space where existence was not supposed to be possible, something that had been doing this for longer than the stars had been burning. And humanity's resistance had woken it up. It had spent billions of years quietly erasing the universe one correction at a time, and it had never encountered resistance because there had never been anything alive long enough to resist. Until now. Now it knew humanity was there, and it was not happy about it. Lena sat in her lab and stared at the data that proved something in the nothing was aware of them, and she felt very small and very frightened and very stubborn all at the same time. She picked up her communicator and called Osai, and when he answered she said, "We have a problem." And Osai, who had spent his life studying the nature of reality, laughed a short, sharp laugh that had no humor in it and said, "We have always had a problem, Lena. We just did not know what it was." Outside the ship the stars burned on, and the nothing grew, and somewhere in the deepest, darkest center of it, all something that should not have been able to think, was thinking about humanity for the first time. And it was deciding what to do about them.